We're living in a multi-dimensional universe, and there's at least 11 dimensions. Otherwise, the universe would collapse. Each dimension is a 90-degree angle right above the next one, compactified, so they're sitting right on top of us. So within less than a Planck unit of space above you, there's another dimension that actually exists with a whole nother universe happening simultaneously while we're sitting right here. Wild.
That's hard to fathom. It's hard to fathom. So right here where we're sitting right now, there's a whole nother dimension of a whole nother universe happening, life taking place.
Yes.
Right in the same space that we are.
Right here. Right here where we are. Right here. Vast too, vast. Just as vast as ours is vast. And from higher dimensions, they experience time differently. Time really doesn't exist. The past, present, and the future happen all at once. So somebody, for example, from the fifth dimension would look at us and they'd be able to see us. Imagine us in this building here, but imagine when I first walked in, and imagine us in here, and imagine me like in the bathroom or something. They'd be able to see us in all the different rooms. The different rooms represent different time frames of existence within this structure. So they could see the past, present, and future at the same time. So it's pretty cool. Weird stuff starts happening the higher the dimensions you go.
So is the idea that when you're in a higher dimension, you can see below lower dimensions, but you can't see dimensions above you?
Exactly, unless you have the capability of matching. First, you have to obtain the frequency of a higher dimension and then match that frequency to be able to walk in. So
match the frequency.
Yeah, so for example, okay, my hand is stopped now by this table, right? Why is it stopped? I'm not really touching the table. There's repulsion going on. Electromagnetic repulsion between the electrons in my hand is repelling the electrons in the table. You don't really touch anything. Now, if I can match the subatomic frequency of the atoms in this chunk of wood here on this table, I could, with my hand, I would be able to pass my hand right through this table unscathed. Why? Because atoms are 99.999% empty space. Nothing is really here. Everything is only a light wave slowed down to a particular frequency. And so if you can match frequencies, you can merge with things. You can walk through walls and all that kind of stuff. The things that seem paranormal could be advanced beings have tapped into some type of understanding of how to match different frequencies in our dimension and appear apparitional or paranormal, but in true reality, they could just be taking a peek in.
And how did we come to the understanding that these higher dimensions exist? Like, what is the most basic evidence that we have of this?
Quantum physics proves it. See, when we look into the quantum world, everything changed. In standard physics is where we are right now, in the large side of physics. But the smaller you go, the more weird things get. We find that particles transphase in and out of existence, and they go to different dimensions. We even know now that some of our synapses of our thoughts in our brain phase out of this dimension and they go somewhere else, and then they come back again. And this has all been tracked and traced through the understanding of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and understanding that dimensions exist. The biggest way that we made a model of this is we figured out how to create something called quasi-crystals. Now, these quasi-crystals are these multi-dimensional crystals. We actually created an 8th dimensional quasi-crystal.
We created this?
Yes, we created it.
How did we create it?
We created in a laboratory using different technologies. And then from that 8th dimensional quasi-crystal, it casts a shadow of itself down to a 4th dimensional quasi-crystal, which then casts down a shadow which creates a sphere. So we know that the universe is most likely the shadow of a higher dimension. It's crazy stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of mind-bending.
We're living in a light matrix, which is actually a light matrix, which is a shadow of a much higher dimension. And so we know this because they created these crystals, these quasi-crystals, and when they put them at different angles, they cast shadows. Sometimes
what do these crystals look like?
So you look up the quasi-crystals, they look like, have you ever seen Adinkra codes? Adinkras?
I think I've heard you talk about this before. No,
they look like Adinkra symbols, mathematical symbols, but in the 3rd dimensional time space. And so if you take them and pull them out into a 3rd dimensional time space, they look like these lines that are connected with these nodes like that, you see? Quasi-crystals.
This is a quasi-crystal.
Yeah.
And so
it's an ordered structure, but it's not periodic. And it's got a crystalline
formed
pattern.
atomically in a manner somewhere between the amorpha solids of glasses, special forms of metals and other minerals, as well as common glass, and the precise pattern of crystals.
Yeah. So if you type in if you put 8th dimensional quasi-crystal, you should see some research that come up on that. It
looks like what you look into a kaleidoscope.
It's a fractal. It's all about fractal. We live in a fractal holographic universe. The quasi-crystal is a fundamental basis of the fractal holography that we're living in. We're fully immersed in it, so we can't detect it, but we're living in a light matrix. And that's what the Adinkra codes also prove.
Okay, explain the Adinkra codes. What is that exactly?
So Professor James Gates Jr., University of Maryland, former scientific advisor to President Obama. Just to give you, like, this guy, he's not just like a jackpot or something. He's like a real dude, you know?
Yeah.
And he put together a team of the most incredible supersymmetry and theoretical physicists in the world, like the top brains in the world on this. And they started analyzing what is the ether of space-time. What is this soup that we're living in, that we're inhabiting, this universe? What is it? What is it made of? What's powering it? They discovered something called Adinkra codes, which go back to the ancient Dogon tribe from Mali, Africa. The original inhabitants of the land of Kem then moved to Mali later after they were thrown out, taken over at one point. But they still kept this ancient knowledge in Mali about these Adinkra codes, and they would draw these patterns. Well, he discovered that these patterns are actually mathematical codes. And these are not just any mathematical code. There goes one there. They're actually the codes that describe the ether of space-time itself. They're error-correcting codes, the same exact codes that run our search engines and web browsers that we're using right now to look at the image. There's coding behind that screen that runs this, what we just did. And guess what? It's the same code that runs the universe. So we discovered that we're living in a programmed light matrix. There's a software programmer that has written this code.
Austin, pull up more images of this.
There's all different types of images. There you go. See, now that you see that one there, right there. That's a quasi. That looks like a lot like a quasi-crystal. If you were to shrink it down and put a whole bunch of them in one location, it looks very similar to a quasi-crystal. So these are Adinkra codes, and you can see the colorful one that was up there. These are depicting the nature of reality.
Wow.
And they actually are mathematical programming codes. They're a special type of code, though. They're error-correcting codes. The same type that Google browser is running on is the same thing that runs the universe.
Error-correcting codes.
Yeah.
And what do we gain from all of this knowledge? Like, what does this tell us, and where do we take this? Like, what is the, obviously this is like foundational knowledge for us, but like, where do you see it going?
Well, if you understand that we're living in a fractal holographic light matrix, it doesn't mean we're not real. It just means that there is a creator or creators, that we're living in something that was created, just like the ancient texts and all the scribes and biblical texts and everything else says. But it tells us, wow, this is the method of the creation. Now we're getting closer to understanding what we really are. We understand now that consciousness isn't made inside this avatar body, that the avatar body doesn't even exist, that consciousness is a stream of something, coming from somewhere else, and is being picked up in this matrix with this coding. If you took all the humans on Earth, there's 8 billion humans on Earth. If I took all 8 billion humans and removed the empty space between their atoms, I can fit every human into a sugar cube. One sugar cube can hold all 8 billion of us.
Really?
Yeah.
All the atoms of 8 billion people on Earth.
You can see atoms are empty space. If you take the empty space out, you collapse it into one sugar cube. All 8 billion can fit in one sugar cube. So what does that mean?
Wild.
What's here? There's only one consciousness, it seems, and it's like a radio station that's transmitting out a frequency from a higher dimension. Our avatar bodies pick up that frequency. You're 99.1, I'm 99.2, he's 99.3, but it's still coming from the same source. And so we're all coming from the same source. It's like the universe has found a way to live subjectively through multiple entities, but not even through entities, even through objects that we consider to be man-made, because every atom we know now in quantum physics is also conscious.
You have heard me do lectures and podcasts talking about the nature of our reality. And in those lectures and podcasts, I often bring up the Adinkra codes. The Adinkra codes, and a professor here in modern times that has deciphered an Adinkra code that runs the ether of space-time itself. Today, I'm bringing you the receipts as I was able to get Professor Sylvester James Gates Jr. Now, who is he? Sylvester James Jim Gates Jr. is a distinguished theoretical physicist whose career spans several prestigious positions and significant contributions to physics. Can you give us some insight into Adinkra codes, what they are, and how they may explain what's going on within the fabric of the universe?
So, yes, I'm happy to always talk about these because they are my mathematical intellectual babies.
Yes.
These are things that I, along with another physicist in 2005, we were studying equations, the kind of equations everybody studies. And we suddenly realized that inside of these equations, there are smaller pieces of mathematics. It's a little bit like, you know, if you look at a substance, people will tell you, oh, if you have a powerful enough microscope, you can see the atoms inside the substance. And so we discovered inside of the math smaller pieces of mathematics that no one had ever realized were there. And it turns out that these smaller pieces of mathematics could be illustrated not just by writing equations, but by representing the equations as pictures. And what is sitting behind you is one of these pictures that represents some of the equations that, if we live in a supersymmetrical universe, will describe some forms of matter and energy we've never seen before.
Wow, incredible. And I heard you mention that web browsers and search engines use error correcting codes. And in some way, these Adinkra codes also represent error correcting codes. Is that true?
That's all true. You've done your homework very, very well, Billy. This is, in fact, a shocking truth. So, you know, if you ask scientists what's in the world, we'll start talking about atoms and electrons and protons and neutrons and all of those sorts of things. And we use equations to describe these objects. Well, it turns out that if this balance, remember I talked about the balance between bosons and fermions, if this balance is really present in nature, it turns out that from our exploration of these symbols behind you, we found out that in order for every piece of matter and every form of energy in the universe to exist, if they exist via these equations demand that they are related to error correcting codes, the kinds of error correcting codes that make computers work. Now, this statement is so astounding, and let me just make sure people understand, it's not that I'm doing all this work by myself. I am intensely collaborative, and so I love to work with people. And like I said, we first discovered these things with Michael Fox. A few years later, I formed a group of 3 mathematicians and 3 physicists in order to study these things. And this collaboration, and let me name my collaborators if I may, is Charles Duran, Kevin Iga, Greg Landweber. They were the mathematicians. On the physics side, it's me, a friend of mine who's a professor at Howard University named Tristan Huch, and Michael Fox, one of the original people who, a person that I found this work with. We were studying these things and we realized that in order to define matter like we see it in our universe, or to define energy as we see in our universe, you have to use error correcting codes. This result was so astounding that for 3 years we couldn't get any physics or mathematics journal to publish our results because nobody believed it.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I mean, the implications are incredible because now we're talking about, are we living in a holographic universe? I believe that there's a creation here because I think the mathematics proves that we're living inside of a creation, but could these Adinkra codes possibly be some type of evidence if it's, that there is a creation?
There certainly are. If you go online, and I'm sure you've done this, there are many people who interpret our results as implying that. I'll never forget the first time I saw an online comment about these results. It was from a young person who was a Catholic, who followed the Catholic faith, and effectively he wrote this article that said, if these codes are there, this person said they knew who wrote the codes. And of course, they were talking about a creator.
Right.
My view is different about this because, as a scientist, what I know are a couple of things. First of all, science can never be used to disprove fate. This shocks people when I say it, but it's actually true. Because if any scientist ever walks up to you and says, I have a piece of science that disproves your faith, there's a very simple question that you can ask them, which is, how uncertain are you? Because if they tell you they're not uncertain, then they're not talking about science. You see, science is always about uncertainty. So you can never rule out absolutely belief by using an argument based on science.
Gotcha. You're talking about the uncertainty principle, possibly, right?
This goes beyond that uncertainty, but yep, that's certainly part of it. Yep.
Okay. Wow. Incredible. And, well, when you talk about, people talk about the fact that we could be living in a creation, not just spiritual people, but also people just following the science, researchers, like myself, looking into what is this realm that we're living in? How was it created? What is the code that's running it? And I think that, from my perspective, it seems as if we're living in something that mathematically is created. Who is the programmer or programmers? I don't know. Did it start spontaneously? Maybe that's also a possibility because, like you said, uncertainty. We can't say anything with complete certainty. But it really, when I started studying fractals and the Mandelbrot set, it really started getting me thinking, is this universe fractal based? And if it is, have you seen any research into fractals and maybe the theoretical physics and supersymmetry that you study?
Not in the work that I have been responsible for introducing into the physics conversation. In fact, it's interesting you should ask that question. This is something I've actually wondered about for years, is whether we would bump into fractals somehow by studying these objects. Like I said, we first proposed their existence. And remember, when I say objects, I'm talking about mathematical objects. I'm not talking about
right. Yes.
So we have, in studying these mathematical properties, we have yet to see the emergence of fractals, which is a little bit surprising to me, but who knows? I don't claim to be any kind of all-seeing wonderkin. In fact, I tell people I'm a simple country theoretical physicist, and I dig mathematical ditches. That's what I do. And so I follow my nose, I work very hard, and I try to surround myself with people who are incredibly gifted in mathematics and physics, and we work together to unearth these really weird things. We don't know what they're going to mean, but if we're very lucky, we have found something profoundly interesting about our universe, as is implied by the comments that you just made.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Have you found any potential technological potential with, this knowledge, this information about Adinkra codes and error correcting codes and what it could mean and what the implications could mean? Do you think there's any technological output that we could see from this?
So let me tell you a true fairy tale. In the 1860s and 50s, there were people in England, in particular a man named George Johnstone Stoney, who most people have never heard of. This person, because he was doing electroplating, I don't know how many people in your audience are familiar with electroplating, where you use electricity, put one metal on another and bind it. He was a chemist and he was working with this, and he thought, I could understand what's going on if there's something in nature smaller than an atom. Now, in Western science, the idea of the atom goes back several thousand years to the ancient Greeks. And no one had ever thought about something smaller than the atom. But this particular scientist did. Well, it turns out that the thing he was thinking about now actually he named it. It's called the electron. And so that doesn't have any technological applications. Oh man, does it. So, but this story, the reason I tell this story is because that's the time scale to think about what people like me do. It's not gonna show up in a decade. It may not show up in a century, But if we are lucky and we have gotten it right, maybe on the order of several centuries, some incredibly interesting technology will likely emerge. And that's the best I can tell you.
Right. I got to ask you, how in the world did you get into these types of studies? What was the factor that said, you know what, drove me right into learning this kind of information?
Well, in some sense, it's the universe itself, and I'll have to explain that. Yeah. So, my father was a soldier in the U.S. Army, and he went in during World War II. And after the war was over, he got out, but he didn't rejoin the Army. So that when I was born in 1950, he was back in the Army. When I was 4 years old, he was stationed at an Army base in Canada. Most Americans don't know that up until the middle 60s, the U.S. military actually had bases in Canada that were left over from the Second World War. So one of these bases is in a place called St. John's, Newfoundland. And Dad was stationed there, and they had quarters for dependents. So my father, my mother, father, and my siblings, we all lived in the housing that was provided by the Department of Defense. One day, my mother took me to see a movie. It's the first movie I ever remember seeing in life. And I was 4 years old, and I have carried pictures in my head of that movie for now 70 years. So maybe 15 or 20 years ago, I started using what's in here, combining that with the internet and the web to see if I could figure out what movie this was. Because that evening, my parents used to say, when Dad came home from work, I told him I wanted to become a scientist. So my first time saying I want to be a scientist was 4 years old, apparently. Now, I don't remember saying it, but that's what my parents tell me, and I trusted them. So
wow. Well,
I was always headed in this direction because of that movie, and because my mother took me to see that movie, and also because of some strange things in our family. So my grandfather was a sugarcane farmer near Minden, Alabama. It's the closest large town. And he could neither read nor write, but he could do arithmetic. At least that's what we were told in the family lore. Why is that important? Well, farmers often have to buy implements and seed on credit. You go to the store, you have a credit account, you buy your plows, maybe the harnesses for your donkey or mule, and the seed that you're going to plant. And you buy it on credit. You get it on credit. There are ledgers that are kept by the storekeepers. And of course, this is like, we're talking about the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. My dad was actually born in 25. So my grandfather was a farmer. He was not a sharecropper. He owned land, but he was a farmer. And so when disputes arose between the white store owners, because Black people basically were not allowed to own stores at that time, and certainly not in the South.
Yeah.
When there would be disagreements over the ledger, my grandfather was a person both sides trusted to look at it and get the numbers right. So it's kind of peculiar. I mean, it's a peculiar part of our family that my grandfather could neither read nor write, but he could cipher, as the expression was called in the community. He could cipher with numbers. This of numbers also showed up in my father's life. He never finished high school because he joined the Army at age 17. So he joined the Army before he finished high school. But while he was in the Army, he got his general equivalency degree, GED. And part of that was mathematics. And so I remember as a kid, when we were living in Texas at Fort Bliss near El Paso, I remember watching my dad study mathematics, and he clearly enjoyed it. So you can see this really weird thing in our family that my grandfather was kind of into math, even though he was a sugarcane farmer. My father was a soldier. And my dad actually used mathematics, for example, in trying to figure out when different divisions would, different groups of soldiers would meet when they were on march, And he has this famous story that he told us about impressing a white officer because he had this ability in his head to essentially calculate times and distances and make predictions when the groups would meet. So he was into mathematics. I've always loved mathematics. And I have a daughter who studies black holes in mathematics. And her twin brother is actually a biologist, but he studies brain cells. He actually grows brain cells on test tubes. And that's, there's math involved in that. So I like to tell people math is actually our family business now for 4 generations. It's really peculiar, but it's kind of true.
Wow. That's incredible. That's an incredible story. I mean, and clearly in some way, you guys are passing down some incredible DNA when it comes to mathematics.
I agree with you, Billy. That's the only explanation I have for why we have this persistent attraction in my family that we can document to mathematics, something most people can't stand. And like I said, for us, it's to show you how crazy it is. Let me tell you a story about me and when I entered school.
Yeah.
When I started first and second grade, I was having trouble with the language arts. I was having trouble learning to read and write, but I was having no trouble with arithmetic. And so I often tell people that if you see something I've written and it's got spelling errors or punctuation or grammar errors, please forgive me, because you see, English is my second language. Mathematics is actually my first language, because I was doing that just fine when I entered school. And like I said, it's weird, but it's true.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You were talking at the base root language, which is mathematics anyway. So you were talking the universal language, because I believe that is the language of the universe, literally, mathematics.
It's the closest language we humans have developed for having that intimate conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And, when you get into quantum mechanics and quantum physics, what role does that play in your studies or with what you've researched over the years?
So let me start with my introduction to this object of this idea of quantum. If you look at our society today, the word quantum is everywhere. Quantum computing, quantum information, they're going to, quantum, right?
Yeah.
But my involvement in quantum goes back to when I was 8 years old, sort of. We were living in El Paso. My father brought home Encyclopedia Britannica. I like to tell this generation that was our version of the web, was the encyclopedias, because we look at the waiting. Because
Mine
that's
too.
When we had homework, we would go to the encyclopedia to look it up, right? So one day, I was just thumbing through the encyclopedias, and I came across this thing. I couldn't figure out what it was, but it had equal signs and plus signs in it. So I knew it was mathematics. In my second year as an undergraduate at MIT, I saw this thing again. It was a Schrodinger equation, which is in fact the mathematical basis for quantum theory. So the equations I study all involve quantum theory. Those are the only kinds of equations I study.
Gotcha. And I think some people get confused between quantum physics and quantum mechanics, even though they both go one and the same. What is the distinction between the two?
So quantum mechanics, I would say, is kind of a more mathematical framework. It sort of sets the stage for how to incorporate quantum effects into observations. Quantum mechanics turns out to be essentially how our species first applied quantum ideas to how atoms work. So it's a more limited application of the ideas. That's the way I would parse those two terms.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And one of the most incredible experiments that I talk about from time to time on my podcast or when people are interviewing me, they're asking me about the nature of reality, and I bring up the double slit experiment.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just best for it not to come out of my mouth. Can you break down the double slit experiment a little bit for those who may have never heard of it before?
I can, but I'm not going to be any better at it than you, Billy. Because so one of the people that I had the great pleasure to have as a kind of a research mentor was a physicist named Richard Feynman. I was a
Oh
postdoc.
man.
I was a postdoc at Caltech from 1980 to 1982 in the research group that he headed, along with another Nobel laureate named Murray Gell-Mann. So I was a postdoc in that group. I refer to Feynman because Feynman says nobody understands quantum mechanics. If that genius can say that, then I'm going to stick with it. I don't understand quantum mechanics. I can write some equations and tell you what the equations say, but I don't have an intuitive feel, and I've never met anyone who intuitively has a feel for what the nature of reality is when you start including things like quantum mechanics, with its strange attribute of an entanglement, by the way, which is basically says that if you start with two particles that are quantum mechanically interacting with each other, if they separate even over long distances, somehow there's something like a ghost-like communication between the two of them. And this effect is actually being developed not only by our government, because if you can actually get technology based on this, you will have communications that no one can break into. You know, it's like having a code no one can break. And so the Chinese government is also investing in explorations. In fact, they have some of the world's most accomplished scientists working on this question. So even though it's weird, it may yield technologies that can have extraordinary impacts on humanity.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I could see for just with quantum entanglement of two communications devices, one out in deep space, maybe you send a group of satellites out into deep space out by Jupiter or Saturn, and so you park them there, right? And then they have a quantum entangled communications sender and receiver on it, and maybe the home base is somewhere, I don't know, Houston, right, Texas, or the coast of Florida. And then you take a vacation out to go see the rings of Saturn or Jupiter. Instead of sending back a signal back to Earth, which would take months for them to get the signal at the speed of light, and then months for them to return that signal back to you, you can actually just send your signal to the satellite that has that quantum entangled communications receiver in it, and it will transmit that back to Earth instantaneously, and then you can get a response back. I think at that point, the only delay would be how long it takes for the satellite to transmit back to your ship, depending on where you are in location to that satellite or array. So by that method, it could be incredible.
That is the dream, Jim. That's the dream, Billy, and maybe it will become reality. None of us can say with certainty that it won't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. You use that a lot, but with certainty, I get it. But that would be an amazing piece of technology. That would really make deep space travel, I mean, like for just vacations, for example, space vacations, it would make it a true reality, because the dangers of deep space travel are immense. But when you can at least be in communication, I think that cuts down some of the apprehension.
That's exactly right, because if you have such communication, then you have access to all the information back here on Earth, more or less at your fingertips, and that might be very helpful to get you out of a dangerous situation.
Exactly. Yeah. That would be so powerful. When you're teaching all of these incredible, intricate topics, because I know you're teaching right now still, and you're like, how do you lead in with this information? Are these people that are coming to your classes already geniuses, or how do you begin to break down these incredible theories?
So, first of all, I have been teaching now for 52 consecutive years.
Wow, that's my age.
Really? I'm surprised. You look much younger than that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
But the first time I stepped into a university classroom to teach was in the summer of 1972 at MIT, and I was teaching a course in calculus. And so, in fact, that class is really why I became a professor, because before that I really wasn't particularly interested in teaching. So how do I teach? Well, the first thing I try to get my students to understand is that ultimately they have to be able to teach themselves, and that I'm just kind of a translator. I'm trying to translate ideas in such a way that they resonate with things my students already know. That's one important thing. I learned I could teach myself after my freshman year at MIT. I figured that out, and that's part of the way I got through MIT was, professors stand, they talk, but you gotta to own it, right? And the only way you can own it is that, in some sense, you have to take it internally. And so that's the first thing I try to get across to my students, that I can be a guide, but I can't really teach you, but you can learn via what I'm saying. So it's translating from crazy math to ideas that already exist in their heads. In fact, that image behind you is kind of is one example of that, because when I and my colleague first discovered these mathematical things, we would talk to them, to other physicists and mathematicians, and even they couldn't understand us. And so at some point, Michael and I hit on the idea that if we draw pictures that had enough data and information in them, then we could communicate these ideas to people. And so that's what I try to do with my students, that same kind of process.
Gotcha. Now that's exactly the method that I use to try to teach the people that I speak to through my digital medium, through TV shows, through workshops and classes. Same exact technique. The ultimate way to teach is to get someone to become their own researcher.
Right.
That is the trick.
That is the trick. And like I said, I learned that at MIT during the summers. I was stunned. I had never known I could teach myself, and yet I did. And ever since then, that together with using the power of the mind. I'm not a neurophysiologist or anything like that, but I talk to people who study the mind. And one of the things that I've learned from them is that there are kind of two of us, of every one of us. There's our conscious mind, but there's also subconscious. Yeah. I'd like to tell people that it's your subconscious that makes you pick green over red as your favorite color. It's not your conscious mind. It's just a feeling that you have, and that comes from your subconscious. And so one of the things that is often said about the subconscious is that it actually processes orders of magnitude more information and data than our conscious mind. And one of the principal tools by which it does that is visualization. That a large part of the data handling capacity of a human brain is wrapped up in processing visual data. And so when I translate equations into an image like that behind you, it means that part of the mind that works on visual and visualization can suddenly become involved, even though it's your conscious mind who wants to do the math. And in fact, that's what happened. I mean, I know this is what happens because this is what I actually experienced. This is gonna sound weird, Billy, but I actually sometimes
dream. No, it's not gonna sound weird.
I sometimes dream in mathematics and come back and talk to other people, and the dreams are verified. And so I know that one's subconscious can actually get engaged in mathematics. And I'm not the only person. In fact, I like to point people to a mathematician, an Indian mathematician by the name of Ramanujan. If you know the name, you can go look it up. He is the most incredible example in history that proves that the human mind does mathematics in dreams and at the subconscious level. And the other thing I tell people is, how many times have you gone to sleep and said, "Oh, let me sleep on it," and then in the morning, all of a sudden, there's something there? Where did that come from? Right? Where did that solution come from? It's your subconscious mind at work.
Yep, that's right. It's processing possibilities, possible outcomes.
Exactly.
Yep, because everything exists in superposition, so the mind is going through all these hoops and jumps and everything else while you're sleeping, and it's coming up to its own conclusions.
Yep. And sometimes it communicates those to you.
Yes. And sometimes it communicates, but sometimes the people don't listen to their own voice.
Well, that's true too. It's very interesting to come to trust that part of yourself. Like I said, I learned to trust it learning calculus, basically. Because it sounds like it's magic or demons or angels. I mean, it sounds like something not part of the human experience, right? But that's the way minds can work.
Yes, I agree 1,000%. I mean, this has been an incredible discussion. Matter of fact, I'm writing a book right now called Fractal Holographic Universe, The Matrix Code Revealed.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, it's going to be a deep book. And in that book, I actually reference some of the work you've done in Supersymmetry, giving you full credit. I don't go on too much about it, but I definitely reference it in the book. And so I'll definitely be happy to send you a copy of the book to take a look at it and for you to have a copy.
Love to see it.
Yeah. It's going to be an amazing book. Be out probably in about another month. It'll be out, and I'll make sure I get a copy sent out there to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, what advice would you give to young scientists who are intrigued by, the fundamental questions of the universe and supersymmetry and supergravity and quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and trying to unravel it all? What advice would you give them?
Well, this is a question I often get, Billy, and I always start by saying I don't give advice. Because to give it good advice, I have always thought you need to know a lot about the person you're giving it to. And that's almost never the case.
Wow.
What I am willing to do is talk about my own journey and what was important for me to be able to reach my dream, because for many years I could not have stated what it was I was trying to do, but I can now. Mm-hmm. It has been my dream from before I could enunciate it to find a piece of mathematics deeply buried in nature, and that provides an accurate description of something. And I may have done that in my life. So the first thing I tell young people is, for me, the first secret of getting to where I am is to ask a much simpler question. You don't ask, how can I be successful, or how can I be famous, or how can I make a lot of money? For me, the first question is, what do I care most deeply about? What's most close to my heart? Because if I can answer that question, particularly if I'm trying to do something, if it's close to my heart, I'm probably willing to work really hard to get it to happen. It's something I will do all that I can to keep alive. And sometimes that means going through terrible pain and suffering. Many times I've given talks to young people, and they've assumed that I sailed through MIT. That's not true. In fact, my first 2 years at MIT were the most emotionally stressful time in my entire life. I used to cry regularly over not being able to do homework. And what it taught me was some things about my subconscious, because this was causing extraordinarily deep pain for me. And I eventually figured out that if I didn't find a way to release this positively, that it would destroy me. Now, the release is kind of funny. I learned to bowl, Billy. Seriously, I learned to bowl.
Wow.
I tell students, I used to use 16 pound ball, 90 feet of waxed wooden lanes, 10 pins down at the other end. And sometimes I could imagine the faces of my teachers on those pins. And I would just work the frustration out. And it worked. Even though I was terrible at taking tests, I could do this to feel better about myself. Because I got to be very proficient at bowling now. If you're a bowler, you perhaps know that a perfect game is 12 strikes in a row. I have thrown games of 10 strikes in a row in my life. So I was playing at a professional level, and it was because I needed a way to get rid of these negative emotions, and that for me was the outlet. So the other thing, the reason I share this is I tell young people, you must manage together with your subconscious to find a way to be successful, because that's what I did.
That's so powerful, because you're really talking about the fact that you literally followed your passion. And you didn't chase after fame. You didn't chase after Nobel Prizes. You didn't chase after money. You followed your passion, and that attracted to you the success and the level that you are right now in society and in scholarship and everything else. And I think people need to hear that message. Everyone who's listening, make sure that you do something that you're passionate about. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to have any obstacles in your way. You're going to have to overcome those obstacles and maybe even find an outlet for the frustration, like Professor Gates has done, but you can do it. Professor Gates, it's been an honor having you on here. The last thing I want to do is I want you to mention the nonprofit that you have.
Well, it's not my nonprofit, but it is a nonprofit associated with my high school alma mater. It's called the Jones High School Foundation. And every year, my old high school has an award for the best math or science students. Actually, there are two of them. And since 2004, I've made sure that every student who receives this award is handed a check for $1,000. And it's not a scholarship, it's an award. It's an award that says you have done something extraordinary, and the world will find a way to recognize you and lift you up. And I'm just doing my little part here. And there are no restrictions on this. It's not a scholarship. I don't care how they spend it, but I want them to know that that kind of dedication has a reward, even if you can't see it at the time.
Can you dive a little deeper into supersymmetry and exactly what it is?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's only a theory, but this is a theory in the esoteric sense of the word. It's a piece of mathematics. Part of it looks like our reality, and part of it we've never actually observed in the laboratory, and that's why it is technically a theory. So, first of all, everyone has heard of electronics because, gee whiz, that's how we're able to talk to each other, electronic means, right? And so that means the electrons are moving back and forth and carrying our sound, the sound of our voices, our images, and what have you. But electrons actually spin like little basketballs. So I always have the image of Metal Lark Lemon spinning that old basketball back in the old days. And so when people think of electrons, they should actually think of that image, that electrons can spin. And so the peculiar thing about electrons is that you can never slow them down, nor can you ever speed them up. The only thing that you can do different is spin clockwise or anti-clockwise. And it turns out that electrons are not the only things that have this property. The proton and neutron have this property, for example. On the other hand, light, everyone knows about light and particles of light, and all of that goes back to the ancient Greeks. Light, on the other hand, actually spins at twice the rate of the electron, which is like kind of curious. And then finally, in 2012, we finally, as a species, found a particle that doesn't spin at all. It's called the Higgs boson. And so supersymmetry ties together why all of these different things might be in nature. But like I said, right now it's just a piece of mathematics.
Gotcha. And why do they call the Higgs boson the God particle?
Well, I'm going to tell you the real reason, and then I'm going to tell you what people think. For many years, a lot of physicists at different laboratories were searching for this thing because it was predicted in the mathematics around 1968 or 72, and it wasn't discovered until 2012. And so that's the way theoretical physics works. We look to math to guide us to go look for things, and then we go look for them. And so in one of those sets of searches for the Higgs particle occurred in the United States at a laboratory in Batavia, Illinois. It's called the Fermi National Accelerator Lab. And the director of that laboratory was a gentleman who had become the recipient of a Nobel Prize. His name was Leon Letterman. And one day someone in frustration was talking to him about the not being able to find the Higgs. And he said, "Where's that GD particle?" And that's the first time the word God was attached to the Higgs particle. Since then, people have cleaned it up a bit. So, people say, oh, it's going to be the one that controls, blah, blah, blah. But that's the original definition.
Gotcha. And so with supersymmetry, what does that have to do with supergravity or superstring theory?
So if you look at all the particles that we know about now, there's an imbalance. In fact, we know about many more particles that are like the electron, we call particles with that property called fermions. Then we see particles that share the attributes of particles of light or the Higgs, which we call bosons. And so supersymmetry says, imagine a piece of mathematics where the two numbers are equal. Everything balances out. And that's why we say symmetry, because it's a balance. And so if you look at supersymmetric equations, and that's what I've been doing since I was a graduate student at MIT. I was the only graduate student at MIT who thought this stuff was interesting from about 75 to 77. and then I got my PhD, and I've continued to look at this math. But when you look at the Higgs particle in the presence of this idea, you can begin to understand why you should expect a Higgs particle. And even more so, the mathematics predicts that there will be at least 4 other things that we should go looking for that have properties of not spinning at all, like the Higgs boson.
Wow, that's incredible. And so I know you've spoken extensively on mathematics and reality. And what is the role of mathematics in this supersymmetry? Does it describe actual physical structures that exist within the universe?
It describes physical structures that may exist in the universe. Especially when I talk to the public, I try to make a very sharp distinction. Mm-hmm. Physics is not a faith-based operation.
Yes.
In physics, we have got to see Mother Nature provide us the evidence before we accept it. On the other hand, we must be allowed to think about what-if questions. What if nature is a little bit different than the way that we see? So, for example, everybody knows about gravity, but with this principle of supersymmetry, there's something called supergravity. It's a modification of Einstein's work. And in fact, that when I was a postdoc in the period 1977 to 1980, I was at Harvard, and a collaborator of mine named Warren Siegel and I were looking at this modification. So the thing about math is I tell people math is really extraordinary. It is our species' most exotic and eloquent language. What do I mean by that? Well, it's exotic because so few of us speak it well. Almost nobody speaks mathematics well. That's what makes it exotic. On the other hand, many of us believe that there are probably other intelligent life forms in the universe. And if they ever come here to visit us, hopefully with peaceful intent, the only language that we will probably share with them will be mathematics. And that's its eloquence. So mathematics is this really strange thing. It's a form of human language. Not many people speak it well, and I don't pretend, by the way, to speak it well myself. Although I tell people I speak a slang version of mathematics. I'm talking slang here when I do math. I look to real mathematicians to clean it up and make sure it's precise to their standards, because that's what guides science.
Right, absolutely. And I saw that you had done some work with NASA in the field of extraterrestrial research or communications, or was it mathematics, or exactly what was it?
So I think I applied to be an astronaut when I was young. And so that's the closest I ever, and they told me no, by the way. So that's the closest I've ever actually worked with NASA.
Yeah.
However, I've been on advisory boards. So for example, and I've written scientific papers about what might be seen related to this idea of supersymmetry. So, we've actually used a math to say, well, if we use this math, how does it change what people think we'll see? And I've written several papers on that over the years. But that's the closest I come to working with NASA. Although I had a friend who became an astronaut. His name was McNair. And Ron and I were in graduate school. Most people don't know that Ron had a PhD in laser physics, but he did before he became an astronaut.
Wow, that's incredible. Your work to me, man, has just been so inspirational. I remember I saw you on a panel one time with Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was actually hosting the panel. You were on a panel of theoretical physicists and I guess experts in supersymmetry.